The wall began on April 3, 1889, just outside what would become the town of Clearwater, Idaho Territory, and by noon of that first day, Marcus Reinhold had already attracted 3 neighbors to the edge of his property line to watch him dig. The trench he carved into the volcanic soil measured exactly 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, stretching in a precise rectangle that would eventually encompass his cabin, his barn, and the well he had dug the previous autumn. The temperature that morning registered 47 degrees on the thermometer nailed to his porch post, cool enough for heavy work, warm enough that the ground had finally thawed after the long mountain winter. By sundown, Thomas Cartwright, who owned the spread 3 miles to the north, had ridden back to the general store in town and announced to anyone who would listen that the German had finally lost his mind. This was not an entirely unreasonable conclusion. The Idaho Territory in 1889 presented settlers with countless urgent problems: irrigation, fencing for livestock, breaking sod for crops, constructing outbuildings before the brief summer ended. And not a single one of those problems appeared to require a 4-foot-wide trench dug in a perfect rectangle around a man's entire homestead. Marcus had filed his claim the previous spring, arriving with a wagon containing not the expected plows and seed stocks, but instead 300 pounds of lime powder, 40 bags of sand, and a collection of hand tools that the freight clerk at the Lewiston depot had never seen before. Now, he spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it from books rather than conversation, and when asked where he had come from, he would say only Wisconsin most recently, in a tone that suggested Wisconsin was merely the last in a long series of places he had been. What no one in the Clearwater Valley knew, because Marcus saw no reason to tell them, was that he had been 18 years old on the night of October 8, 1871, working as a kitchen hand at the Peshtigo Company logging camp in northeastern Wisconsin. He had survived what would later be calculated as the deadliest fire in American history by spending 6 hours submerged to his chin in the Peshtigo River while the town around him ceased to exist. The official death count would eventually settle at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 souls, the uncertainty itself a testament to how completely the fire had erased the community. Marcus had watched people burn to death on the riverbanks because they could not force themselves to enter the water. He had watched the air itself ignite. He had watched the fire create its own weather, generating winds that exceeded hurricane force and threw flaming debris miles ahead of the main front. He had been pulled from the river the following morning with burns on his face and hands and an understanding of fire that would never leave him. 18 years had passed. He had worked the lumber camps of Minnesota and the Dakotas, eventually following the Northern Pacific Railroad west as a section hand and then as a bridge crew supervisor. He had observed the railroad's method of protecting wooden trestles and station buildings, cleared zones, gravel borders, and where possible, stone or earth barriers that could deflect radiant heat. When he filed on his 160 acres in the Clearwater drainage, he did so with a specific intention. He would build the kind of homestead that would survive what he knew, with absolute certainty, would eventually come. The Clearwater Valley in 1889 was timbered country, Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, and western larch covering the ridges and draws, the understory thick with 9 bark and ocean spray, and the accumulated deadfall of decades without significant fire. The local Nees Purse had managed this landscape with intentional burning for generations, but their removal to the reservation 11 years earlier had ended that practice. Marcus looked at the fuel load surrounding his new home and saw the Peshtigo woods of his youth. The question was not whether fire would come, the question was when and whether he would be ready. Thomas Cartwright was 53 years old in the spring of 1889, a former cavalry sergeant who had mustered out at Fort Lapwai and decided he liked the country well enough to stay. He had been ranching the Clearwater drainage for 11 years, running mixed cattle and hogs on unfenced range that stretched from the river breaks to the timbered ridges. He had seen dry years, and he had seen fires, small ones mostly, the kind that burned through a draw or took out a few acres of grass before running into something that wouldn't carry flame. The idea that a man would spend his first spring digging trenches instead of working his ground struck Cartwright as something between foolishness and insanity. He said as much to Marcus directly on the second day of the digging, riding his bay gelding to the edge of the property and sitting there watching the German work. "You planning to defend against Indians?" Cartwright asked. His tone was not hostile, merely baffled. The Nez Perce War ended 12 years ago. The reservation's 40 miles south of here. Marcus continued digging, his shovel biting into the dark volcanic loam with a rhythm that suggested he could maintain this pace indefinitely. Not Indians, he said. Fire. Cartwright looked around at the April landscape, patches of snow still visible on the north-facing slopes, the grass barely beginning to green, and the timber dripping with snowmelt. Fire, he repeated, in April. The wall will not be finished until July, Marcus said. The fire will not come until August, perhaps September. This is the correct sequence. Cartwright sat his horse for another long moment, watching the trench extend another 3 feet. What exactly do you think a wall is going to do against fire? Fire goes up. Fire jumps. I've seen fires throw embers half a mile ahead of the main front. Marcus stopped digging long enough to look up at the rancher. His pale eyes held the particular flatness of someone who has seen things they do not care to describe. You have seen small fires, he said. I have seen fire that made its own wind, that created a sound like 1,000 locomotives. Man, that burned people who were standing in rivers because the air itself was hot enough to kill. He returned to his digging. The wall is one element, the cleared zone is another, the water system is a third. Together, they create a space where fire cannot sustain itself. This is not theory, this is engineering. Cartwright had no response to this. He was accustomed to men who talked too much and men who talked too little, but he was not accustomed to men who talked like they were reading from a technical manual while describing nightmares. He rode home and told his wife that the new German was touched in the head, but harmless enough, and did not give the matter further thought until June. The construction method Marcus employed was not original to him, but its application to a frontier homestead was unprecedented in the Clearwater Valley. The basic principle came from his observations of railroad firebreak construction, combined with techniques he had read about in a translated German forestry manual that he had carried west from Wisconsin. The trench served as the foundation for a wall that would eventually stand 4 feet high and 3 feet wide at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. The wall itself was constructed of rammed earth, local soil mixed with approximately 15% lime and a small quantity of sand to improve binding, then tamped into wooden forms in 6-inch layers and allowed to cure before the next layer was added. Each section took approximately 4 days to complete, 1 day for mixing, 2 days for ramping and tamping, each 1 day for the forms to be removed and reset for the next section. The total perimeter measured 1,240 linear feet, requiring 312 individual sections at 4 feet each. Marcus had calculated that the wall alone would require approximately 4,800 man-hours of labor. He had also calculated that he had exactly 147 days between April 3rd and August 28th, the date by which he intended the system to be complete. This meant averaging 33 hours of work per week on the wall alone, in addition to the minimum requirements of feeding himself, maintaining his cabin, and establishing enough garden production to see him through the following winter. It was an aggressive timeline. Marcus had no intention of missing it. The other settlers in the valley watched this construction with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and increasingly vocal skepticism. Walter Hennessy, who ran sheep on the benchlands 6 miles east, rode over in late April to examine the work firsthand. Hennessy was 61 years old, born in County Cork, and had been raising livestock in the American West for 33 years. He walked slowly around the completed sections, approximately 80 feet of wall at that point, running his hand along the smooth, hardened surface. I'll grant it's solid work, Hennessy said, but I've been through fire seasons in California, fire seasons in Nevada, fire seasons here. A wall doesn't stop fire. Fire doesn't care about walls. Marcus was mixing another batch of rammed earth, his arms coated to the elbow in pale gray mud. A wall stops radiant heat, he said. A wall stops direct flame contact. A wall breaks wind. The fire may burn to the edge of the cleared zone. Yeah, but it will not have fuel to carry it forward, and it will not have heat to ignite what is beyond. And what about embers? Embers come down like rain in a big fire, land on your roof, land on your barn, and you're burning anyway. Marcus pointed toward his cabin. The roof will be covered with 6 inches of soil by July. The barn the same. The well provides water. The cisterns provide more water. 4 of them, each holding 800 gallons. When fire comes, I will wet everything that can be wetted." Hennessy looked at the cabin, then at the partially completed wall, then back at Marcus. "You're talking about a siege, like you're preparing for a medieval siege, except against fire." "Yes," Marcus said. "That is exactly correct. Fire is an enemy. It must be treated as such." Hennessy left, shaking his head. But unlike Cartwright, he did not ridicule the project in town. He had seen enough country burn in his 33 years to know that the German, however strange his methods, was at least thinking about a real problem. That distinction would matter in August. By June, the wall was 60% complete, approximately 750 feet of continuous rammed earth barrier, standing 4 feet high and already beginning to weather to a color that nearly matched the surrounding soil. The wooden forms had been moved and reset 186 times. Marcus had developed calluses on his calluses, and his shoulders had taken on the particular thickness of a man who moves heavy weight all day every day. Inside the perimeter, changes were becoming visible. He had cleared all vegetation within 20 feet of the wall's interior face, scraping the ground down to mineral soil and raking out every root, every stem, every piece of organic matter that might carry flame. The cabin and barn sat at the center of this cleared zone, their roofs now covered with the promised 6 inches of soil, carefully graded to shed water, and planted with a thin covering of green clover that Marcus watered every evening from his well. 4 brick cisterns, each measuring 8 feet long by 4 feet wide by 4 feet deep, had been constructed at the cardinal points of the compound, one north of the cabin, one south, one east, one west. A hand pump connected to the well allowed him to fill these cisterns, and a simple gravity feed system of clay pipes could deliver water from the cisterns to any point within the compound. The total water storage capacity was 3,200 gallons, much enough to wet down every surface multiple times if necessary. The neighbors had largely stopped coming to watch. The novelty of the Germans' strange project had worn off, replaced by the pressing demands of summer work, haying, fence repair, the endless struggle to get water to livestock during the dry months. The Clearwater Valley that June was running approximately 3 inches below normal precipitation for the year, a deficit that caused some grumbling, but no real alarm. The old-timers said it would balance out in the fall. The old-timers were wrong. Margaret Pruitt, who operated the general store in town with her husband Samuel, was one of the few people who maintained regular contact with Marcus during this period. He came to town every 2 weeks for supplies, more lime, more sand, nails and hinges for the gates he was constructing, some kerosene for his lamps. Margaret noticed that he also purchased unusual items, several large canvas tarps, extra buckets, a peculiar hand-pumped sprayer that the catalog described as intended for orchard use. When she asked about these purchases, Marcus was politely evasive. "Preparation," he said. "It is better to have and not need than to need and not have." Margaret was 46 years old and had operated the store for 19 years. She had learned to read her customers, and what she read in Marcus Reinhold was not madness, but rather something closer to its opposite, a terrible clarity of purpose that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. She began to pay closer attention to the weather. When if you find value in these accounts of practical wisdom tested against real conditions, the kind of knowledge that history tends to forget once it becomes common sense, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. What we preserve here isn't entertainment. It's the record of how ordinary people solved extraordinary problems through nothing more than observation, preparation, and the courage to be called foolish. The algorithm favors consistency, so your subscription matters more than you might think. Now, back to the story. July brought heat, not the gentle warmth of a normal mountain summer, but a persistent building pressure of high temperatures and zero precipitation that began to brown the grasses by the second week and had the timber visibly stressed by the third. The thermometer on Marcus's porch post, say which he checked and recorded in a leather-bound journal 3 times daily, showed a progression that concerned him. 89 degrees on July 3rd, 94 degrees on July 11th, 97 degrees on July 18th. Night temperatures, which should have provided relief, remained in the high 60s and low 70s, warm enough that the landscape never fully recovered from each day's baking. The humidity readings, which Marcus tracked using a simple wet and dry bulb thermometer of his own construction, told an even more alarming story. Relative humidity at midday had dropped from the normal 35 to 40% range to readings consistently below 25%, and on 3 consecutive days in late July, he recorded afternoon readings of 11, 9, and 8%. These were conditions he recognized. The air was pulling moisture from everything, from the grasses, from the timber, save from the very soil. The landscape was becoming fuel, and it was doing so at a rate that exceeded anything the long-term residents had experienced. Thomas Cartwright rode by in the last week of July, ostensibly to check on a steer that had wandered onto Marcus's unfenced section, but actually, Marcus suspected, to evaluate the completed fortifications with his own eyes. The wall was now finished, 1,240 feet of rammed earth, 8 gates positioned at intervals for access, the interior fully cleared and the buildings fully prepared. Cartwright sat his horse and stared at the structure for a long moment. "It looks like a fort," he said finally. "That's what it looks like. You've built yourself a fort in the middle of cattle country." "It is not designed to stop bullets," Marcus said. "It is designed to stop heat." Cartwright shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. "I've been ranching here 11 years. Never seen a fire get anywhere near a homestead. The grass burns, sure. Timber burns sometimes. But fire needs fuel. And around homes, there's usually enough bare ground and grazed-down pasture that fire just goes around." Marcus looked at the ridges surrounding the valley. The timber stood dark and dense, the understory a tangle of dead branches and accumulated duff that had been building for years, decades maybe, without the regular burning that the Nez Perce had once applied. "The fuel load in those ridges has been accumulating since 1877, he said. 12 years of growth, 12 years of deadfall. When that burns, not if, when, it will not behave like the fires you have seen. It will generate its own weather. It will move faster than a horse can run. It will throw embers not half a mile, but 2 miles, 3 miles ahead of the front." Cartwright's face tightened. "You don't know that." "I know fire," Marcus said. "I have seen fire at its worst. I survived it once. I do not intend to rely on luck a second time." The rancher rode away without further comment, but Marcus noticed that he did not laugh this time. The conditions were making believers of people who had been skeptics just weeks before. The question was whether the belief would translate into action in time. August 1889 arrived with a temperature of 101 degrees on the first day, measured at 2:15 in the afternoon, and relative humidity of 7%. Marcus recorded these figures in his journal with the same methodical precision he had applied to every measurement since April. But the precision could not disguise the significance of what he was documenting. He had never recorded humidity this low in 4 months of observation. The leather binding of the journal itself was cracking from dryness. The timber had taken on a grayish cast, the green fading from the needles as the trees sacrificed their extremities to conserve water for their cores. Every afternoon, rising thermals generated dust devils that spun across the benchlands, pulling debris hundreds of feet into the air before dissipating. Lightning was coming. Marcus could feel it in the way the air pressed against his skin, the way the horses in the valley pastures stood with their heads low and their ears back. The first storm arrived on August 9th. It came from the southwest, building through the afternoon as a wall of charcoal gray clouds that flickered with internal lightning but dropped not a single measurable drop of rain. This was the phenomenon that weather observers would later call a dry thunderstorm, and it was among the most dangerous meteorological events the inland west could produce. Ignition without suppression, fire starts without the compensating moisture that might limit their spread. Marcus counted the flashes visible from his porch, 147 distinct lightning strikes in the 4 hours between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m., scattered across a front that stretched from the river breaks to the timbered ridges 10 miles to the east. Not all of those strikes would find receptive fuel, but some of them would. The next morning, August 10th, smoke was visible on the eastern horizon. It rose in a thin column from somewhere in the timber, too far away to see flames, but close enough that the particular blue-gray color was unmistakable. A second column appeared by noon, this one to the southeast. By evening, there were 5 distinct smoke columns visible from Marcus's property, and the air had taken on the acrid tang that he remembered from the lumber camps, the smell of burning pine resin and superheated sap. The fires were still small, still distant, still contained by the natural barriers of ridges and rock outcrops, and the lack of wind. But they were burning, and the conditions that had created them were not improving. The evacuation, such as it was, began on August 14th. A rider from town, one of Margaret Pruitt's sons, a boy of perhaps 16, came up the valley road at full gallop, stopping at each homestead long enough to shout that the fire on Miller Ridge had jumped the creek and was moving west. "Pa says everyone should get out while they can," the boy said. "Fire's moving faster than anyone expected. Could be at the valley floor by tomorrow." Marcus received this news while filling his cisterns for the third time that day, pumping water from his well with the steady rhythm he had maintained for hours. He stopped long enough to thank the boy, then returned to his work. The boy looked at the wall, the cleared zone, the wet canvas tarps draped over the windows of the cabin, and seemed uncertain whether to insist on evacuation or accept that this man had made his own choice. He rode on. Throughout the valley, families were loading wagons. The Cartwrights had 3 wagons for their household goods and were driving their cattle south toward the river, where water and a wide rocky wash might provide some protection. Walter Hennessy had already moved his sheep to a benchland he considered defensible, a flat expanse of overgrazed pasture where the fuel was so thin that he believed fire would simply pass around it. The Pruitt family was closing the store and retreating to the river as well, taking what merchandise they could carry and trusting that the brick walls of the building might survive what was coming. Marcus stayed. He had spent 142 days preparing for exactly this circumstance. He had no intention of abandoning that preparation now that the test had arrived. The afternoon of August 14th brought winds from the east, unusual for that region, yards where prevailing winds typically came from the southwest, and with those winds came a change in the fire's behavior. What had been multiple distinct fires began to merge, their individual circulations combining into a larger system that generated its own weather patterns. Smoke plumes that had risen vertically began to angle sharply, driven by winds that were being created by the fire itself rather than by the larger atmospheric conditions. Marcus had seen this before. At Peshtigo, the fire had generated sustained winds of over 100 miles per hour, winds that threw burning logs through the air like javelins and created conditions that no structure, no defensive preparation could withstand. But Peshtigo had been a perfect storm of bad conditions. Unprecedented fuel loads, extreme drought, multiple fires merging across a vast area, meaning a community completely unprepared for what was coming. The Clearwater Valley was not Peshtigo. The fuel load was heavy but not unlimited. The drought was severe but not unprecedented, and one homestead at least was prepared. The question was whether preparation would be enough. The fire reached the eastern ridges of the Clearwater Valley at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on August 15th, 1889. Marcus recorded the time in his journal, along with the estimated wind speed. He judged it at 25 to 30 miles per hour, based on the movement of the treetops visible on the ridge, and the direction of the smoke column, which had shifted from the vertical to an angle of approximately 45 degrees, indicating that the fire was being driven by wind rather than rising purely on its own convection. Though the sound reached him before the flames were visible, a roar that built gradually from a distant thunder to something that shook the air itself, a continuous rumble punctuated by sharper cracks as individual trees exploded from the internal pressure of superheated sap. He had filled his cisterns to capacity, 3,200 gallons of water, distributed among the 4 brick tanks. He had wetted down the roof of his cabin and barn, the canvas tarps over his windows, the interior walls of his cleared zone. He had positioned buckets of water at intervals around the compound, each with a burlap sack that could be soaked and used to beat out spot fires. He had sealed the gaps under his doors with wet rags. He had brought his 2 horses into the compound and tied them in the center of the cleared zone, where they stood trembling but contained. When he had done everything he could do, the rest was mathematics, the calculations of heat transfer and fuel consumption and radiant energy that would determine whether his preparations were sufficient. If you have ever wondered whether practical knowledge truly makes a difference when conditions become extreme, whether preparation actually matters when nature decides to test everything you've built, this is the moment where that question gets answered. Stories like this one exist because someone took the time to record what worked and what didn't, and because others have preserved those records against the tendency of history to forget. If this channel provides value to you, a like and subscription help ensure that these accounts continue to reach people who want to understand how problems were solved. The algorithm is simple mathematics too, and your engagement makes the difference between these stories being seen or buried. Now, the fire. The wall of flame that descended from Miller Ridge was approximately 1 mile wide. Marcus could see it clearly now, not as individual flames, but as a continuous front of orange and white, the color of molten metal, throwing a pillar of smoke and steam that rose thousands of feet into the afternoon sky. The heat preceded the flames by hundreds of yards, a wave of superheated air that made the thermometer on his porch post, which had read 103 degrees at noon, climb past 120, past 130, past the point where the alcohol in the tube could no longer register. The sound was no longer thunder. It was continuous, a sustained roar like standing next to a waterfall or a locomotive running at full steam. The timber between the ridge and his homestead, approximately 3/4 of a mile of mixed fir and pine, was catching faster than he could have imagined, each tree igniting not from direct flame contact, but from radiant heat alone, exploding into fire as the energy accumulating in the advancing front exceeded the ignition temperature of the resin-soaked wood. The fire reached the edge of Marcus's cleared perimeter at 4:47 p.m. He knew the exact time because he was still recording it, standing on the roof of his cabin, which was covered with 6 inches of wet soil and actively steaming in the heat, with his journal and pencil, documenting what was happening with the same methodological precision he had applied to every aspect of this project. The wall worked. This was not a gradual realization, but an immediate, a visceral confirmation of everything he had calculated. The flames, which had been crowning through the timber at heights of 100 feet or more, reached the edge of the cleared zone and dropped to the ground. There was simply nothing to burn at that height. No branches, no understory, no fuel ladder to carry the fire upward. The ground-level flames, fed by accumulated duff and fallen branches, raced to the base of the wall and stopped. The wall itself was not combustible. The rammed earth, cured and hardened over 4 months, was essentially stone. It might crack from thermal stress, but it would not ignite. The radiant heat that crossed the wall was intense, hot enough that the soil on his roof began to dry and crack within minutes, hot enough that the air itself felt like opening an oven door. But it was not hot enough to ignite the wetted surfaces of his cabin. It was not hot enough to carry flame across the 20-foot gap between the wall and the nearest structure. It was not hot enough to overcome the thermal mass of the earthen barriers he had constructed. The embers came, exactly as Walter Hennessy had predicted. Thousands of them, millions maybe, swirling in the convective currents that the fire generated. They landed on his roof and sizzled against the wet soil. They landed in his cleared zone and found nothing to ignite. They landed on the canvas tarps over his windows and were quenched by the moisture that Marcus had applied not an hour before. He moved constantly, a bucket in one hand and a soaked burlap sack in the other, beating out the few spot fires that managed to establish themselves in cracks of his compound. The horses screamed and pulled at their tethers, but did not break free. The air was nearly unbreathable. He had wrapped a wet cloth around his nose and mouth, and even so his lungs burned with every inhalation, but it was survivable. At 6:15 p.m., the main fire front passed his property and continued west, seeking new fuel in the timber beyond. Behind it, the landscape was transformed. Where there had been dense forest, there was now a moonscape of ash and blackened trunks, still smoking and still throwing heat, but no longer actively flaming. Marcus's homestead sat in the middle of this devastation like an island, the green of his clover-covered roofs almost obscene against the gray and black that surrounded it. He had survived. But the aftermath revealed itself over the following days as survivors emerged from their refuges and began to assess what had been lost. The numbers were stark. The Clearwater Valley had contained, before August 15th, 23 homesteads, a general store, a small church, and approximately 4,000 head of cattle scattered across the range. After August 15th, 18 of those homesteads were gone. Not damaged, gone, reduced to ash and foundation stones and the twisted remnants of iron stoves. The general store had survived, its brick walls scorched but intact, though the wooden additions on the north side had burned entirely. The church was gone. Of the cattle, Perhaps 1,200 had survived by reaching the river or finding refuge in the few areas where the fuel had been insufficient to carry the fire. Thomas Cartwright had lost his house, his barn, his equipment shed, and approximately 200 head of cattle. He had saved his family by driving them into the river and keeping them submerged while the fire passed over their heads, an experience that his 12-year-old daughter would describe in a letter 50 years later as the night we became fish to avoid becoming ash. Walter Hennessy had fared better. His sheep, clustered on the overgrazed benchland, had survived almost entirely, and his own cabin had escaped the worst of the flames due to a quirk of topography that channeled the fire round rather than through his property. But he had lost his hay barn and 3 months of winter feed, a loss that would force him to sell half his flock before autumn. The most complete devastation belonged to the Anderson family, Swedish immigrants who had homesteaded a beautiful timbered section 8 miles up the valley. The family, parents and 4 children, ranging from 3 years old to 14, had attempted to shelter in their root cellar when the fire approached. The root cellar had not been deep enough. The heat had penetrated. A rescue party found them on August 17th, still in the cellar, still together. The funeral was held on August 22nd in the open air because there was no longer a church, and every surviving family in the valley attended. Marcus Reinhold stood at the back of the gathering, his face unreadable, and when the service concluded, he walked directly to Thomas Cartwright, who was standing with his wife and children looking at 6 fresh graves. "I can teach you," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, when carrying no trace of satisfaction or vindication. "The wall, the clearing, the water system. It is not complicated. It is labor, yes, but it is not complicated." Cartwright looked at him for a long moment. The rancher's face was burned in patches, his eyebrows gone, his hands wrapped in bandages that his wife changed twice daily. "I said you were touched in the head," Cartwright said finally. "Said it to anyone who would listen. Said it for months." "Yes," Marcus said, "you did. I was wrong." There was no negotiation in Cartwright's voice, no attempt to qualify or explain, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had learned something at a cost he would carry for the rest of his life. "I would be grateful if you would teach me." The rebuilding began in September. It began not with structures, but with walls, rammed earth barriers surrounding the sites where new cabins would rise, cleared zones extending outward from those barriers, cisterns dug at compass points. Marcus worked alongside his neighbors now, teaching the mixing ratios for the lime-stabilized earth, demonstrating the tamping technique that produced maximum density, explaining the geometry of thermal protection. The construction was slower than his own had been because the labor was divided among multiple sites and because the survivors were simultaneously trying to recover what they could of their livestock and prepare for a winter that would not wait for their convenience. But it proceeded. By the first snowfall on November 3, 1889, 4 homesteads had completed defensive perimeters. Shores and 3 others had partial walls that would be finished in the spring. Walter Hennessy, who had escaped the worst of the fire, was among the first to complete his construction. "I got lucky," he told Marcus, standing at the edge of his new wall in late October. "That benchland saved me, not anything I did. Luck doesn't repeat itself. This..." He gestured at the 4-foot barrier surrounding his rebuilt cabin. "This is not luck. This is preparation." The methodology spread. A reporter from the Lewiston Tribune visited the valley in November to document the reconstruction, and his article, published on November 17, 1889, under the headline, "German Engineer's Method Saves Homestead from Catastrophic Fire," was picked up by newspapers as far away as San Francisco. The article contained numerous errors. Marcus was not an engineer, then had never claimed to be, and the wall was not fireproof, as the reporter stated, but merely fire-resistant. But the core message was accurate. A systematic approach to fire protection had proved itself under extreme conditions. What worked, worked. What didn't had burned. The Idaho Territorial Legislature took notice. In the spring of 1890, a representative from the newly organized Territorial Fire Commission traveled to the Clearwater Valley to document Marcus's methods. The resulting report, published in June of that year, recommended that all new homesteads in timbered regions consider implementing the Reinhold system of defensive perimeter construction. The recommendation was not a requirement, The territory lacked the resources to enforce such mandates, but it was distributed to every land office in Idaho Territory and posted in every town where settlers might pass through on their way to new claims. The Forest Service, which would not be formally established until 1905, would eventually codify similar principles under the term defensible space. The concept that a zone of reduced fuel around a structure significantly improves its chances of surviving wildfire. The specific measurements would be refined over decades of research. The modern standard calls for 100 feet of defensible space, with the first 30 feet being the most critical, but the fundamental insight remained exactly what Marcus had understood in 1889. Fire is an engineering problem. And engineering problems have engineering solutions. Marcus Reinhold lived in the Clearwater Valley for another 41 years. He never married, never had children, never accumulated significant wealth despite the value of his land as the region developed around him. He served on the volunteer fire brigade that the valley organized in 1892. He taught the wall-building technique to anyone who asked, never charging for the instruction. When the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway extended a line through the valley in 1909, the surveyors noted that his homestead was the oldest continuously occupied structure in the region. Everything else had been rebuilt at least once since the fire of 1889. He died on March 3, 1930, at the age of 77 from pneumonia that developed after a fall in his barn. His obituary in the Clearwater Tribune ran 6 paragraphs and mentioned that he was known as the builder of the wall that saved his homestead in the Great Fire of 1889, but did not explain what the wall was, how it worked, or why it mattered. By 1930, every homestead in the valley had some form of defensive perimeter. The technique had become invisible through success. No one remembered that it had ever been remarkable. The contemporary applications of Marcus Reinhold's insights extend far beyond the Clearwater Valley. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection now requires defensible space around all structures in designated fire hazard zones, with specific requirements for vegetation management and construction materials that echo the principles Marcus implemented in 1889. So the Insurance Institute for Home and Business Safety has documented that homes with proper defensible space are up to 80% more likely to survive wildfire than comparable homes without such preparation. The cost of implementing these measures, which might run to a few $1,000s for vegetation management and a few thousand more for fire-resistant roofing and siding, is trivial compared to the cost of rebuilding after a total loss. Yet, every fire season, homes burn that could have been saved. They burn because their owners did not take the time to clear the vegetation, did not invest in fire-resistant materials, did not accept that fire is not a theoretical risk, but an inevitable one in the landscapes where they chose to live. They burn because their owners believed, as Thomas Cartwright believed in April of 1889, that it probably wouldn't happen to them. Marcus Reinhold did not believe in probably. He believed in mathematics, the mathematics of fuel load and ignition temperature and radiant heat transfer, and the simple, brutal calculation that preparation costs less than reconstruction, and reconstruction costs less than death. He was mocked for this belief. He built his wall anyway. And when the mathematics proved themselves on August 15, 1889, he did not say, "I told you so." He simply began teaching others what he knew, because what mattered was not recognition but survival, not being right but being ready. The wall he built stood for 127 years, finally demolished in 2016 when the property was subdivided for a housing development. The developer who purchased the land considered the wall a curiosity, an obstacle to efficient lot layout. None of the homes in that development include defensible space. The Clearwater Valley has not experienced a major fire since 1889, but the conditions that created that fire, the fuel accumulation, the drought cycles, the timber density, have not changed. If anything, they have intensified, as a century of fire suppression has allowed fuel loads to build to levels that even Marcus might not have imagined. When the next fire comes, and it will come, because fire always comes to this landscape, the homes in that development will face the same test that Marcus faced in 1889. They will not have walls. They will not have cleared zones. They will not have cisterns filled with water and canvas, tarps ready to deploy. They will have, at best, garden hoses and faith in the fire department. That is not mathematics. That is hope. And hope, as Marcus Reinhold understood better than most, is not a survival strategy. The stories we tell about the past are not entertainment. They are instruction, lessons paid for in suffering and preserved against the certainty that the conditions which created them will come again. The German immigrant who built a wall in 1889 was not touched in the head. He was paying attention. He was remembering what he had survived and building accordingly. His neighbors thought he was foolish until the fire came. Then they thought he was wise. Then, within a generation, they forgot his name entirely, even as they adopted his methods. This is how practical knowledge works. It becomes invisible through success. The wall that surrounded his homestead looked strange on April 3, 1889, when he began digging the foundation trench in the spring mud. When it looked like madness to everyone who saw it. It looked like wasted labor, misplaced priorities, the obsession of a man who could not move past something that had happened 18 years before and 1,000 miles away. But it kept his home standing through the worst fire Idaho Territory had seen in recorded history. That is not luck. That is not coincidence. That is engineering. That is preparation. That is the difference between people who understand that extreme events require extreme preparation and people who believe that experience of normal conditions prepares them for abnormal ones. The neighbors stopped laughing and started measuring. They stopped mocking and started building. They learned because the alternative to learning was burning, and the fire did not care about their opinions. It cared about what worked. Only Marcus Reinholdt's wall worked. It worked because he built it to work, because he calculated and tested and refined until the mathematics were on his side. And when the test came, the mathematics did not fail him. They never do.